The sun was just beginning to set, casting long, orange shadows across the city streets. It was that time of the evening when the tall buildings looked like they were glowing from the inside out. For most people, this was the time to go home, to sit in traffic, or to think about dinner. But inside the big glass tower in the center of the city, the day was far from over. The lobby of the building was huge. It was all polished stone and shiny metal, designed to make people feel small when they walked in. In the middle of this open space, sitting alone on a small stage, was a grand piano. It was black and sleek. It looked perfect. But like everything else in the lobby, it was just part of the design. It was there to look expensive, not necessarily to be played. An older man walked slowly across the lobby floor. His name was Arthur. He wore the same blue uniform every day. It wasn't fancy, just thick cotton with a name tag pinned to the chest. The pants were a little baggy at the ankles, and his work shoes were scuffed from months of walking on hard concrete. Arthur pushed a large yellow cart in front of him. The cart was filled with spray bottles, trash bags, and mop handles that clinked together softly as he moved. He didn't walk with the hurried, angry steps of the business people rushing past him. He walked with a slow, heavy rhythm. He knew exactly where the squeaks in the floor were and how to avoid them. Arthur was 68 years old. His hair was thin and gray, and he wore glasses that slid down his nose a little bit. He would push them back up with the back of his wrist whenever his hands were wet. He had worked in this building for 5 years. Before that, he had worked in a factory, and before that, he had done many other things. But in this building, he was just the cleaner. To the men and women in suits, he was invisible. They walked past him talking on their phones, holding their coffee cups, looking right through him as if he were made of glass. He stopped his cart near the elevators and sighed. It had been a long day. He had cleaned 3 conference rooms and scrubbed the sinks in the bathrooms twice. He rubbed his lower back with one hand. It always felt stiff around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He looked over at the piano. It was the quietest thing in the lobby. The rest of the building was noisy phones ringing, shoes clicking on stone, voices shouting orders. But the piano just sat there. Arthur walked over to it. He wasn't planning to play it. He just wanted to wipe the dust off the lid. The management was very strict about things looking clean. He took a soft microfiber cloth from his back pocket. He folded it carefully. Up close, the piano was beautiful. He leaned forward and looked at his reflection in the black wood. He saw a tired old man with gray hair and a weary face. It was a face that had seen a lot of hard work and not a lot of rest. As he ran the cloth over the smooth surface, his hands slowed down. The wood felt cool and solid. He looked at the keys. They were white and black, neat, and organized. They reminded him of something else, a different life he lived a long time ago. Arthur didn't talk about his past much. Nobody here asked him about it. They assumed he had always been a janitor. They assumed he didn't know anything about music or art or business. But Arthur had secrets. He had memories locked away in a box inside his mind that he hadn't opened in years. He remembered being a little boy, much smaller than the desks in the lobby. He remembered a house that smelled like old books and soup. In the living room of that house, there had been an upright piano. It wasn't shiny and new like this one. It was scratched, and one of the pedals stuck a little bit. But his mother had played it. He closed his eyes for a moment, just listening to the silence. He could almost hear the sound of her playing. She used to play songs that made him feel happy, and songs that made him want to cry, all at the same time. She had tried to teach him. She had sat him on the bench and placed his small fingers on the keys. "This is C," she would say softly. "And this is D." He had loved the feeling of the keys going down. He loved that he could press a button with his finger and a sound would come out. It felt like magic. But life had a way of getting in the way. As Arthur grew older, there were bills to pay. There wasn't money for lessons or nice instruments. The piano in the old house was sold to pay for a funeral, and then the house was sold to pay for other things. Arthur had to go to work. He took jobs building things, moving things, cleaning things. The music slowly faded away until it was just a ghost in his head. He opened his eyes and looked at the beautiful piano again. His hand hovered over the keys. He wanted to touch them, just to see how they felt. His fingers were rough now. They were dry and calloused from handling chemicals and mops and heavy trash bags. The tips of his fingers were hard, not soft like a musician's. He pulled his hand back. What was he thinking? He was a janitor. This piano was for the lobby, for decoration, for rich people. If he touched it and made a mess, or worse, if he broke something, he would lose his job. He needed this job. He had rent to pay and medicine to buy. He went back to wiping the lid of the piano. He polished it until the black surface shone like a mirror and he could see the lights of the ceiling reflecting in it. He stepped back to check his work. It looked perfect. "Arthur," a voice crackled over his radio. It was the supervisor. The radio made everything sound sharp and crackly. "Yeah, I'm here," Arthur said into the small microphone on his shoulder. "Someone spilled coffee in the break room on the 4th floor. Big mess. Go take care of it." "On my way," Arthur said. He sighed again, a deeper, heavier sigh this time. He put his cleaning cloth back into his pocket. He looked at the piano one last time. It looked lonely sitting there in the middle of the big, empty lobby. It was like a bird that wasn't allowed to fly. "Rest well," he whispered to the piano. He turned around and walked back to his yellow cart. The squeak of the wheel echoed in the quiet space. He pushed the cart toward the service elevators, which were at the back of the building, away from the fancy main elevators. The cleaning crew always had to use the back doors. It was just the way things were. As he waited for the elevator, he looked through the glass walls of the lobby. The sun had gone down completely now. The city outside was a sea of lights. Cars were moving like glowing beetles along the streets. The world was so busy and so loud. Arthur felt small in the middle of it all. He felt like the piano, quiet, watching, but not really part of the music. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding. Arthur pushed his cart inside. He pressed the button for the 4th floor. The doors closed, shutting out the beautiful, shiny lobby and the silent piano. The metal box hummed as it started to go up. Arthur leaned against the wall of the elevator and closed his eyes for a second. He just wanted to finish his shift and go home. He didn't know that in just a few hours, the silence would be broken. He didn't know that his hands, worn out from work, were going to do something that would shock everyone in the building. But for now, it was just him and the cleaning cart, riding up to the 4th floor to wipe up a coffee spill. The 4th floor was a mess. Coffee had spilled across the white table like a dark brown river and had dripped onto the carpet. Arthur didn't complain. He just got to work. He scrubbed the table until it shone. He cleaned the carpet until the stain was just a faint memory. It took him 45 minutes. By the time he was done, his back was hurting more than usual, and he was sweating under his blue uniform. He took the service elevator back down to the lobby. It was much later now. The sun was completely gone, and the sky was a deep, dark blue. The lobby was mostly quiet. The receptionists had gone home for the day. Only the security guards were left, sitting in their booth near the main entrance, watching the cameras. Arthur parked his cart near the corner. He was tired, but he had one more job to do before he could clock out. He had to vacuum the rugs in the main atrium. He walked over to the storage closet to get the big vacuum cleaner. As he walked back, he heard the sound of the main elevators chiming. It was a loud, musical sound that echoed through the huge space. The door slid open, and a group of people walked out. They were loud. They were laughing and talking, their voices bouncing off the high ceiling. They were clearly still at work, wearing their expensive suits and holding expensive drinks. They looked like they had just come from a party. At the front of the group was a tall man named Julian. He was the CEO of the company. He was young, maybe in his 30s, with perfectly styled hair and a suit that probably cost more money than Arthur made in a year. Julian walked with his chest out, like he owned the ground he walked on. He was holding a glass of whiskey and laughing at something one of the other men said. There were 4 other people with him. 2 men and 2 women. They were all dressed up, checking their phones, looking important. They walked right past the security booth without even glancing at the guards. They headed straight for the middle of the lobby, where the grand piano sat. Arthur stood still near the wall. He knew the rule. When the executives were around, you tried to be invisible. You didn't look them in the eye, and you didn't get in their way. He waited for them to walk past so he could start vacuuming in the corner. But they stopped near the piano. Julian took a sip of his drink and leaned against the instrument. He looked at it, then he looked around the lobby. His eyes landed on Arthur. "Hey!" Julian shouted. He waved his hand in the air. "You. The cleaning guy." Arthur flinched. He looked around to make sure Julian wasn't talking to someone else. There was no one else there. He slowly stepped forward, clutching the handle of the vacuum cleaner. "Me, Sir?" Arthur asked. "Yes, you," Julian said. He turned to his friends. "Look, the piano is dusty again. I swear, the cleaning staff here is blind." One of the women laughed. It was a high-pitched, fake laugh. "It's hard to find good help these days, Julian." Arthur felt his face get hot. He walked a little closer. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just about to clean the area. I polished the piano earlier, but dust settles quickly." Julian looked at Arthur with a bored expression. He didn't care about the dust. He was just looking for something to do, someone to tease. He walked over to the bench and sat down. He placed his drink on the floor next to his shiny shoe. "You polish it, but can you play it?" Julian asked. The tone of his voice was mean. It was the tone someone uses when they are making fun of you but pretending to be nice. The group of executives went quiet. They looked at Arthur like he was a zoo animal. Arthur looked down at his shoes. "No, sir. I just clean it." "I didn't think so," Julian said loudly. He cracked his knuckles. "I've been playing since I was 5 years old. My parents made me take lessons. I hated it then, but I love it now. It's an art. You need a brain for it. You need feeling." Julian leaned over the keys and played a fast, messy run of notes. It was loud and aggressive. He wasn't really playing a song, he was just hitting keys to show off. The sound was jarring and harsh in the quiet lobby. He hit a wrong note at the end, but he didn't care. He laughed anyway. "Sounds amazing, Julian," one of the men said, clapping him on the back. "Talent," Julian said, shaking his head. "You either have it or you don't." He looked back at Arthur. "What do you think, old-timer? Sounded pretty good, right?" Arthur gripped the vacuum cleaner handle tighter. He didn't like being called old-timer. He didn't like being mocked. But he needed this job. He couldn't tell the CEO to shut up. "It was very loud, sir," Arthur said quietly. The group laughed again. "Loud? That's a compliment," Julian said. He stood up, looking bored with the piano now. He picked up his drink. "This thing is out of tune anyway. It's probably because no one real ever plays it. It just sits here gathering dust." He walked closer to Arthur. He invaded Arthur's personal space, looking down at him. Arthur could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You know," Julian said, poking Arthur in the shoulder with a finger. "I bet you've never even touched a key. You look at it every night, I bet. Wishing you were rich enough to sit here." "I just like to keep it clean, sir," Arthur said. His voice was steady, but his heart was beating fast. "Clean, clean, clean," Julian mimicked. "Is that all you are, a cleaner?" The silence in the lobby was heavy. The security guards in the booth were watching, but they didn't say anything. They knew better than to interfere with Julian. Arthur looked at the young CEO. He saw a spoiled child in a man's suit. He saw someone who had been given everything and had no respect for anyone else. And then, something snapped inside Arthur. Maybe it was the long day. Maybe it was the memory of his mother. Maybe it was just the sheer unfairness of being treated like dirt by a man who couldn't even play the piano correctly. He looked at the piano. The black and white keys seemed to shine under the lobby lights. They were waiting. "I know where the notes are," Arthur said. He didn't shout. He just said it clearly. Julian stopped laughing. He looked at Arthur, surprised. "What did you say?" "I said, I know where the notes are," Arthur repeated. "I know how to read music. I know what the keys do." The executives looked at each other. This wasn't part of the script. The janitor wasn't supposed to talk back. Julian raised an eyebrow. He found this funny again. "A new game? Oh, really? And where did you learn that? Watching cartoons?" Arthur didn't answer. He wasn't going to tell them his life story. He wasn't going to tell them about the old upright piano in the living room or the mother who taught him to love music before he could even read. They wouldn't understand. They would just laugh harder. Julian stepped back and gestured to the piano bench with a wide sweep of his arm. "Go on then. Show me. Don't be shy." "Julian, come on," one of the women said, looking at her watch. "We have a meeting in the morning." "Relax," Julian said, his eyes glued to Arthur. "This is better than a meeting. I want to see this. Go on, sit down. Play something." Arthur looked at the bench. It looked very small and very far away. If he sat down, he would be making a fool of himself. Or worse, he would lose his job. But if he walked away now, he would feel small forever. He slowly released his grip on the vacuum cleaner. The machine stood there humming softly, a reminder of who he was supposed to be. He walked past Julian. He smelled the expensive cologne and the stale alcohol. Arthur stopped at the piano. He hesitated. He looked at his hands. They were rough. The skin on his fingertips was hard and cracked. There was a small cut on his thumb from a piece of glass he had picked up earlier in the week. These hands were made for scrubbing floors, not for delicate music. "I'm waiting," Julian said from behind him. "Don't tell me you're scared." Arthur sat down on the bench. It was firm and padded. It felt strange to be sitting there, looking at the keys from this angle. Usually, he was standing above them, wiping them down. From down here, the piano looked like a vast ocean of black and white. He felt a tremble in his chest. It was fear, yes. But it was also something else. It was a spark. A tiny, glowing light that had been covered in ashes for 40 years. He placed his hands on his knees. He took a deep breath. The air in the lobby was cool, but his palms were sweating. He could hear Julian shifting his weight behind him. He could hear the whispers of the other executives. They were waiting for a joke. They were waiting for him to hit a wrong note so they could laugh and go back to their important lives. Arthur didn't care about them anymore. He closed his eyes for a second. He blocked out the lights, the glass building, the fancy suits. He thought about the silence. He thought about the feeling of the soundboard vibrating under your fingers. He lifted his hands and placed them gently over the keys. He didn't press down yet. He just let them hover. He was finding his position. He was remembering the shape of the music. "If you're just going to sit there, I'm going to bed," Julian scoffed. Arthur ignored him. He flexed his fingers. He was ready. He didn't know if he could do it perfectly, but he knew he had to try. He was going to show them that the man who cleaned their floors had a soul, too. He was going to show them that beauty didn't come from a suit or a title. It came from the heart. He pressed down the first chord. The very first sound that Arthur made was not loud. It was soft, like a whisper that you have to lean in to hear. His thumb pressed down on a white key, and a single, pure note floated into the air. It hung there for a second, cutting through the thick, stuffy atmosphere of the lobby like a knife through warm butter. Julian stopped shifting his feet. He froze, his glass of whiskey halfway to his lips. The other executives stopped checking their phones. The silence that followed that single note was heavier than the silence before it. It was a waiting silence. Arthur didn't rush. He knew that music wasn't a race. He let his right hand drift a little to the right and pressed another key, then another. It was the beginning of a melody. It was a sound that felt familiar, like a dream you can't quite remember when you wake up. It was Chopin. Specifically, the E-flat major nocturne. The janitor's hands, the hands that were usually covered in rubber yellow gloves or gripping a rough mop handle, began to move with a grace that shocked everyone watching. His fingers were calloused and thick, but they touched the ivory keys with incredible gentleness. It was as if those rough hands had been waiting their whole life just to touch this piano. Julian rolled his eyes slightly, trying to regain control of the moment. He thought Arthur was just testing the keys. "Okay, very nice," Julian said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You found middle C. Congratulations. Can you actually play a song, or is this nap time?" Arthur didn't even blink. He didn't turn around. He just kept playing. Suddenly, his left hand joined in. It started a low, rolling rhythm. It was a heartbeat sound, steady and warm. Thump thump, thump thump. The sound filled the bottom of the piano, vibrating against the floor. Arthur's body started to sway slightly, just a little movement from side to side. The tiredness in his back seemed to disappear. The slump in his shoulders straightened up. He wasn't a janitor sitting on a bench anymore. He was a musician. The melody began to climb. It flowed like water moving over smooth stones in a stream. It was sad, but it was a beautiful kind of sad. It was the kind of music that makes you think of things you lost a long time ago. It made the cold glass lobby feel warm. The executives stopped looking at their watches. They stopped looking at each other with smirks. They started looking at Arthur. One of the women, a tall blonde lady who was usually very critical of the cleaning staff, took a small step closer. Her mouth opened just a little bit. She was watching Arthur's hands. She had seen pianists play before at fancy parties and galas. They usually played fast and showed off their fingers moving like spiders. But Arthur didn't play like that. He played simply. Every note meant something. He didn't waste a single sound. Julian, however, was not impressed yet. He felt annoyed. He was the CEO. He was the one who was supposed to be talented. This old man in a blue uniform was ruining his joke. He took a step forward, intending to tell the man to stop, to say that this was boring. But as Julian opened his mouth to speak, the music changed. Arthur's hands moved further apart on the keyboard. The sound got bigger. It wasn't loud and banging like Julian's playing had been. It was deep and resonant. It seemed to bounce off the ceiling and wrap around everyone in the room. It felt like a physical force, like a warm wind blowing through the atrium. Arthur's eyes were closed now. He didn't need to see the keys. He could feel them. He was remembering his mother's living room. He was remembering the smell of dinner cooking while he practiced scales as a boy. He was remembering the promise he made to himself that he wouldn't let the music die, even when he had to sell his own piano. His fingers moved over a tricky section of the song. They danced over the black keys, weaving in and out. For a second, his pinky finger slipped because of a rough patch of dry skin on his hand. He stumbled on a note. It sounded wrong, a harsh clink in the middle of the beautiful melody. Julian's face lit up. He saw the mistake. He pounced on it. "Ha!" he shouted, pointing a finger. "There it is. I told you. You're just a janitor banging on the keys. You missed it. It's over." The laughter started to bubble up from the other executives. They felt relieved. The order was restored. The rich boss was right, and the poor worker was wrong. They started to turn away, reaching for their drinks and their phones again. But Arthur didn't stop. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look embarrassed. He just kept his left hand rolling that steady heartbeat, and his right hand smoothly corrected the melody. He wove the wrong note back into the song. It wasn't a mistake anymore, it became part of the feeling. It sounded like a stutter in a sad conversation, like someone trying not to cry. The laughter in the lobby died out instantly. It died out because the music that followed was the most beautiful thing they had ever heard. Arthur seemed to pour all his energy into the next few measures. He played with a passion that was scary. It was raw. It was real. He wasn't thinking about the notes on a page. He was playing his life. Every hard day he ever had was in that music. Every time he was ignored, every time he was mocked, every time he had to scrub a floor while someone else walked in clean shoes, it was all there. The song became a cry. It was loud and powerful, sweeping through the lobby like a storm. The glass walls of the building seemed to vibrate. The security guards in the booth stood up. They weren't looking at the cameras anymore. They were looking at the old man in the blue uniform. Arthur's face changed, too. The tired look was gone. His brow was furrowed in concentration. He looked strong. He looked like a king sitting on his throne. The cheap blue uniform didn't look cheap anymore. It looked like a robe. Julian stood there with his fingers still pointing in the air, looking ridiculous. He slowly lowered his hand. He looked at the woman next to him, expecting her to laugh, but she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at Arthur, with tears actually welling up in the corners of her eyes. The music swelled again, high and bright, and then suddenly, it got quiet. Arthur's fingers slowed down. The heartbeat in his left hand became softer. The melody turned into a whisper again. It was like the sun going down behind the clouds. He was approaching the end of the piece, but he wasn't rushing to finish it. He was savoring it. He was letting every last drop of emotion out of the piano. The lobby was completely silent now. You couldn't hear the traffic outside. You couldn't hear the air conditioning. You could only hear the piano. The contrast was stunning. Just 10 minutes ago, this room was filled with shallow chatter and cruel laughter. Now, it was filled with a deep, heavy respect. Arthur didn't know if they were impressed. He didn't really care anymore. As he played the final few notes, he felt a peace settle over him that he hadn't felt in decades. He was doing what he was born to do. He wasn't Arthur the janitor. He was Arthur, the pianist. He played the last chord. It was a deep, rich E-flat major chord. He held his fingers down on the keys, letting the sound ring out into the vast space of the lobby. He pressed the pedal with his foot, sustaining the sound until the air itself seemed to be vibrating. Then, slowly, he lifted his hands. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone in the room realizes they have just witnessed something miraculous. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if time had stopped inside that glass tower. Arthur sat there for a moment, his hands resting on his knees, looking at the keys with a quiet love. The silence was his answer. It was louder than any applause could ever be. The silence stretched on. It wasn't the awkward kind of silence where people look at their shoes or shuffle their feet. It was a heavy, thick silence that filled the entire lobby like water in a bowl. The last note of the piano had faded away, but the feeling of the music was still hanging in the air, pressing against the glass walls. Arthur sat on the bench, his hands resting lightly on his knees. His chest was rising and falling a little faster than usual. He kept his eyes down, looking at the black and white keys. For a moment, he just listened to the quiet. He was afraid to move. He felt like if he stood up, the spell would break, and he would just be an old man in a cleaning uniform again. Julian was standing a few feet away. His mouth was slightly open, the way it is when you see something you didn't expect. His expensive whiskey was tilted dangerously in his hand, but he didn't seem to notice. He was staring at Arthur's hands. He was trying to understand how the hands that scrubbed toilets could make a sound like that. The man who had laughed earlier, the one in the gray suit, cleared his throat. It was a nervous sound. Ahem. It echoed loudly in the quiet room. He shifted his weight and took a sip of his drink, looking around at the ceiling, suddenly very interested in the lights. The woman with the blonde hair had stopped looking at her phone completely. She was standing perfectly still, staring at Arthur. She looked confused, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. Arthur knew he had to move. He couldn't sit there forever. Slowly, he took a deep breath and let it out. He straightened his back. The stiffness in his spine was gone, replaced by a strange kind of warmth. He slid his hands off his knees and placed them on his thighs. He stood up. The bench made a small squeak as his weight left it. The sound seemed to snap Julian out of his trance. Julian blinked a few times. He shook his head, as if he was trying to wake up from a dream. He looked at the other executives, expecting someone to say something, to make a joke, to break the tension. But no one spoke. They all looked uncomfortable. They were all looking at their feet or their drinks. What was that? Julian asked. His voice wasn't booming anymore. It was quieter. He sounded almost uncertain. Arthur turned around to face him. He didn't look down. He didn't look at the floor. He looked Julian right in the eye. There was no fear in Arthur's face anymore. There was just a calm, steady peace. That was Chopin, sir, Arthur said softly. Just like you asked. He didn't say it to be smart. He didn't say it to be mean. He just said it as a fact. Julian's face turned a little red. He gripped his glass tighter. I know who it was. I meant. He stopped. He didn't know what he meant. He wanted to say, you cheated, or you learned that one song just to trick me, but he knew that wasn't true. He had heard the way Arthur played. You can't fake that kind of feeling. You can't fake the way his hands moved like they were born to do it. One of the younger men, a guy with messy hair and glasses, took a step forward. He had been a music student in college before he became a businessman. He looked at Arthur with wide eyes. That was the E-flat major nocturne, the young man said. His voice was full of wonder. I haven't heard it played like that in years. The rubato, the way you slowed down the tempo in the middle section. That was incredibly difficult. My teachers at school could never get that sound. Arthur looked at the young man and gave a small, shy smile. It was the first time he had smiled all night. It is about feeling, Arthur said. You have to let the time go where it wants to go. You can't force it. The blonde woman let out a long breath she had been holding. She walked over to the piano and touched the wood gently, as if it had changed into something holy. I felt it, she whispered. She looked at Arthur, really looked at him, not as a janitor, but as a person. I haven't cried in 10 years, and I almost cried just now. How long have you been playing? Arthur looked down at his rough, work-worn hands. He flexed his fingers. I started when I was 6. My mother taught me on an old piano we had in the living room. But I haven't played properly in 40 years. Maybe more. The group gasped. 40 years. Julian's eyes went wide. 40 years, he asked. You haven't touched a piano in 40 years, and you just played that. I play in my head, sir, Arthur said. I play every night when I am cleaning. I hum the songs. But tonight was the first time I touched a real piano in a long time. The shame in the room was so thick you could almost taste it. These people had everything. They had money, success, nice cars, and big houses. They took lessons at the best schools. They had expensive hobbies. But here was a man who cleaned their messes, a man who they mocked and ignored, who possessed a talent they couldn't even touch. He had kept a fire burning inside him for 40 years, through hardship and labor, while they complained about their stock options and their meetings. Julian felt small. For the first time in his life, he felt like the small one. He looked at his own hands, soft, manicured, and empty. He looked at Arthur's hands, rough, scarred, and full of magic. He realized that he had spent his entire life collecting things that didn't matter, and Arthur had spent his life holding onto something that did. The CEO put his glass down on a nearby table with a hard clink. He ran a hand through his hair, messing up the perfect style. He looked awkward and out of place. Julian started. He cleared his throat again. He was trying to find the right words. The arrogant mask was gone. I didn't know. I thought you were just a janitor. Arthur finished for him. His voice was kind, not angry. Yeah, Julian said, looking down at the floor. I was wrong. It was a hard thing for a man like Julian to say. The words seemed to get stuck in his throat. But he said them. And for a moment, the distance between the CEO in the $1 million suit and the janitor in the blue uniform disappeared. They were just two men standing in a lobby. Arthur nodded his head slightly. He accepted the apology. He didn't need a big speech. He just needed to be acknowledged. It is okay, sir, Arthur said. People see the uniform. They don't see the person underneath. It happens all the time. He walked past Julian. He didn't walk with his head down anymore. He walked with his head up. He went back to his yellow cart where the vacuum cleaner was still standing. He unplugged the cord from the wall and wrapped it around the hooks neatly. The executives watched him. They didn't know what to do with themselves. The party mood was dead. They couldn't go back to laughing and bragging. The music had changed the air in the room. Are you leaving?" the young man with the glasses asked. Arthur looked at the clock on the wall. My shift was over 10 minutes ago, sir. I need to go home. He walked back to the piano one last time. He took the cleaning cloth out of his pocket. He leaned over and wiped the keys one more time, even though they didn't need it. It was a sign of respect. He was saying goodbye to his old friend. Take care of her, Arthur whispered to the piano. He put the cloth back in his pocket. He grabbed the handle of his cart. The squeak of the wheel sounded again as he started to push it toward the service elevators. Wait, Julian said. Arthur stopped. He turned around. Julian took a step toward him, then stopped. He looked confused. He wanted to offer Arthur something: money, a job, a new piano. But he knew that none of those things were the right thing to offer. You can't buy someone's soul. Will you be here tomorrow? Julian asked. Arthur looked at the huge, empty lobby. He looked at the shiny piano. I have a job to do, sir. The floors won't clean themselves. But the piano, Julian said. It should be played. Arthur smiled. It was a sad, but beautiful smile. Maybe it will be. Maybe someone else will play it now. Or maybe it just needs to rest. He didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. He just turned back around and pushed his cart through the wide archway that led to the back hallways. Good night, everyone, Arthur said over his shoulder. He disappeared into the shadows of the service corridor. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. The lobby was silent again. The executives were left standing there in a circle. The piano sat on its stage, gleaming under the lights. It looked different now. It didn't look like a piece of furniture anymore. It looked like a living thing. No one spoke for a long time. They just stood there, listening to the silence, thinking about the old man with the rough hands and the beautiful heart. The heavy steel door clicked shut, and the sound echoed through the service hallway like a gunshot. Arthur stood there for a moment in the dim light, leaning against his cart. His heart was hammering against his ribs, so hard he could feel it in his ears. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a deep, trembling exhaustion in his hands. He looked down at his fingers. They were shaking. They were the same rough, scarred fingers he had always had, stained with the smell of floor wax and disinfectant. But to him, they felt different. They felt lighter. For 40 years, they had just been tools for scrubbing and lifting. Tonight, they had remembered what they were truly made for. He took a deep breath, blowing the air out slowly through his nose. He pushed his cart forward. The squeak of the wheel was back, the familiar sound of his daily life. He walked past the dumpsters and the stacks of cardboard boxes waiting to be recycled. This was the real world. The lobby with its glass and gold was just a stage. He reached the locker room. It was a small, windowless space with gray benches and metal lockers. The air here smelled of sweat and old coffee. Arthur opened his locker and took out his beige jacket and his worn-out hat. He took off his blue uniform shirt, carefully folding it and placing it on the shelf. He hung up his name tag. As he buttoned his jacket, he looked at himself in the small mirror on the locker door. He looked like an old man getting ready to go home in the dark. But his eyes looked different. They were shining. There was a spark there that hadn't been there for a long time. He smiled at himself. It wasn't a big smile, just a small one at the corner of his mouth. "Good job, Arthur," he whispered to himself. He picked up his brown paper bag that held his dinner, a sandwich and an apple, and walked out the back exit. The cool night air hit his face. It was refreshing. He walked to the bus stop, his step a little lighter than usual. He didn't feel the ache in his back so much anymore. He was just thinking about the sound of the piano, the way the notes had hung in the air like stars. Back inside the building, the silence in the lobby was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy with things unsaid. Julian was still standing near the piano. The other executives had drifted away toward the elevators, but they were walking slowly. They weren't talking on their phones. They weren't laughing. The blonde woman was wiping her eye with a tissue. The young man with the glasses was looking at his own hands, flexing his fingers as if he was trying to remember how to hold them. Julian stood alone in the middle of the vast, empty space. The grand piano loomed in front of him. It looked black and shiny in the low light. He walked over to the bench. Slowly, he sat down. He looked at the keys. They looked innocent, just white plastic strips. But he knew now that they were dangerous. They had the power to strip away his expensive suit and his fancy title and leave him feeling small. He looked at his own hands. They were soft. He had never worked a hard day in his life. He had gone to the best schools, had the best teachers, and he had learned to play the notes perfectly. But he hadn't learned to play the music. He put his fingers on the keys. He tried to play the same song Arthur had played. He tried to play the first chord. Plunk. It sounded wrong. It sounded dry and hollow. It sounded like a machine. There was no soul in it. He tried the next few notes, but he couldn't get the rhythm right. He couldn't make the notes sing. He stopped. Julian slammed his hands down on the keys in frustration. A loud, ugly noise rang out through the lobby. He dropped his head into his hands. He felt a burning shame in his chest that he couldn't shake. He had everything, but he had nothing. The young security guard from the booth walked out into the lobby. He didn't say anything at first. He just leaned against the wall and watched the CEO. He was something else, wasn't he? The guard said quietly. Julian lifted his head. He looked at the guard. Usually, he wouldn't even acknowledge a security guard, but tonight he felt like they were on the same level. "Yeah," Julian said, his voice raspy. He was. "He comes in here every night," the guard said. "He sweeps the floor, dusts that piano, and leaves. He never says a word. I didn't know he could do that." "I mocked him," Julian admitted. It felt good to say it out loud, to let the guilt out. "I told him he was just a cleaner. I told him he wouldn't understand the music." The guard nodded slowly. "Well, I guess he showed you." Julian stood up from the bench. He buttoned his jacket. He didn't want to sit there anymore. "Why does he do it?" Julian asked, mostly to himself. "Why does he scrub floors if he can play like that? He could be famous. He could be teaching at a university." The guard shrugged. "Maybe he likes it? Or maybe life just got in the way. It does that sometimes." Julian looked toward the service hallway where Arthur had disappeared. He thought about Arthur's rough hands and his humble attitude. He thought about the way Arthur had smiled when he finished playing, not showing off, just happy to make the music. "I need to change," Julian said suddenly. "What?" "Me this. All of it," Julian said, gesturing to the huge, empty lobby. "I've been walking around this place like I own the world. But tonight, a janitor taught me more about life than I learned in 20 years of business school." He walked toward the elevators, but he stopped before he pressed the button. He turned back to the guard. "Find out his full name for me," Julian said. "And don't tell anyone why. Just get it for me." The guard nodded. "I will." Julian stepped into the elevator and the doors closed. The next day, the building felt the same, but it also felt completely different. The sun was shining through the glass walls. People were rushing around, drinking coffee, typing on computers. It was a normal Wednesday. But at noon, an announcement came over the intercom system. It was usually reserved for fire drills or parking announcements. "Attention, staff," a voice said. It was Julian's voice. He didn't sound bored. He sounded serious. "There will be a new policy regarding the grand piano in the main lobby." People stopped typing. They looked up from their desks in the open offices. They looked out into the atrium. "Effective immediately," Julian continued, "the piano is open for use by any employee of this building. Not just executives. Not just clients. Everyone. Also, if the cleaning staff wishes to play during their lunch break, they are allowed to do so. We encourage it." There was a murmur through the office. People were confused. The CEO was opening the piano to the cleaning staff. Julian walked out of his office and stood on the balcony overlooking the lobby. He watched as Arthur came in for the afternoon shift. Arthur was pushing his yellow cart. He looked tired. He was wearing his blue uniform. He looked just like he did every other day. Arthur stopped at the piano. He saw a small sign on it. It was a gold plaque that hadn't been there the night before. He walked closer to read it. It didn't say "Don't touch." It didn't say "Property of the company." It simply said, "For the dreamers." Arthur stared at the sign. He touched the gold letters with his fingertip. A smile spread across his face. It was a wide, genuine smile that showed his teeth. Up on the balcony, Julian watched. He didn't smirk. He didn't laugh, he just nodded his head in respect. Arthur walked over to his cart, but he didn't start cleaning right away. He looked around. The lobby was full of people working. He saw the young security guard giving him a thumbs up. Arthur walked back to the piano. He sat down on the bench. He didn't care about the dust today. He didn't care about the time. He placed his hands on the keys. He started to play. It was a simple song, light and happy. It wasn't the sad song from the night before. The sound floated up through the building. People stopped typing. They stopped rushing. They stood at the glass railings and listened. For the first time, they weren't hearing the noise of work. They were hearing the sound of a human heart. And in the center of it all, sat an old man in a blue uniform, finally doing what he was meant to do.